All right, so picture this. You're standing right there in the U.S. Capitol building. It's pretty awe-inspiring, right? But have you ever thought about, like, how power actually works inside? It's not just one big decision-making machine. It's more of a dance between the federal government and all the states,
Hmm.
and that's what we call federalism. And that is exactly what we're going to unpack in this deep dive today. We're looking at this presentation called Federalism in the USA to see how this system is working out now in the 21st century.
It's really interesting how federalism is this constant back and forth, trying to balance national unity but also letting each state do its own thing.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope. Okay, so this presentation, it shows how power is divided up. It talks about the Constitution, especially the Supremacy Clause, and the necessary and proper clause. But like the most important thing is how all of this affects you and the rules and laws that impact your life in your state.
Those framers of the Constitution were pretty clever. They really struggled with this, how to bring the whole nation together but still let each state keep its own identity. And their answer, federalism?
It's like they created this special recipe for governing. The Constitution's like the basic ingredients, the foundation. But then each state gets to add its own flavor to the mix. So to get us started, how would you actually define federalism?
Well, basically, federalism is a way to split up the power. It's divided between a central authority. In the U.S., that's the federal government. And then you've got these smaller regional units, the states. So it's kind of like sharing the power.
Not like one side wins everything then. They both have their own jobs to do. Okay, so I keep seeing these terms in the presentation. Enumerated powers and reserved powers. What's the difference? It sounds kind of like legal mumbo-jumbo.
You can think of enumerated powers as things that the federal government is specifically allowed to do. It's like their job description, written right there in the Constitution. Declaring war, making money, like deciding what goes on that $20 bill you're carrying around, say, and making sure that trade between states runs smoothly. These powers belong only to the federal government. It keeps the whole country united and consistent.
So these are like the major league decisions then, the things that affect the whole country. But what about everything else? Where do reserved powers come in?
That's where the 10th Amendment comes in. It says if a power isn't specifically given to the federal government, it's reserved for the states or the people themselves. And that's a lot of power. Think about schools, how fast you can drive on those state highways, even marriage laws. These are all decided at the state level.
Wow, it's like this whole other level of government that's way closer to us, making the rules that shape our everyday life. Okay, so we've got this division of power, but what happens if they clash? Who gets to make the final call? Is that where the Supremacy Clause comes in?
Exactly. It's the tiebreaker.
Hmm.
The Supremacy Clause says that federal law wins out if there's a conflict with a state law. Imagine the chaos if states could just ignore federal laws they didn't like. It would be a mess. This clause makes sure the Constitution is the top dog, and it stops things from turning into a legal free-for-all.
It makes sense. You need to know who has the last word. But the Constitution isn't always crystal clear. Sometimes it's a little vague. And that's where that necessary and proper clause comes in, right? Also called the elastic clause.
You got it. This clause gives Congress the power to create any laws that are necessary and proper for them to actually do the things the Constitution already tells them to do. But this has been a big point of debate. Some say it lets the federal government get too powerful, stretching its authority into areas the Constitution doesn't specifically mention. Like, think back to McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. The Supreme Court decided that Congress had the power to create a national bank, even though the Constitution doesn't explicitly say so. That decision, based on the necessary and proper clause, really expanded what the federal government could do.
Wow. So this clause, that sounds kind of simple, actually had some big consequences. And it shows how the Constitution, while it lays the groundwork, can also change with the times.
Exactly, and that ability to adapt has caused a lot of discussion about the power balance between the federal government and the states. It's this constant tug of war, and the necessary and proper clause is usually right in the middle of it.
Okay, this is fascinating stuff. Let's talk about another important clause, the full faith and credit clause. This one seems pretty key for making sure things run smoothly between states. Am I right?
Absolutely. The full faith and credit clause makes sure states respect each other's official acts, their records, and their court decisions. It's like a built-in system of trust and cooperation. Think about your driver's license. You get it in one state, but it's good in all 50 thanks to this clause. Same goes for marriage licenses and court orders. It streamlines legal stuff and prevents legal chaos.
It makes life so much easier. It's like having a legal passport for the whole country. But are there ever exceptions? What if one state makes a law that totally goes against another state's policy?
That's a great question. It shows how complex federalism really is. There are exceptions, especially if a state law clashes with the fundamental public policy of another state. This is where things get interesting. For example, same-sex marriage. Before the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, some states made it legal, others didn't. The full faith and credit clause didn't force states to recognize these marriages because it went against their own policies.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all rule. There are these gray areas
Hmm.
where things get more complicated. This reminds me of why we're doing this deep dive. Understanding how power works in our country is crucial. It doesn't matter what state you live in.
I agree. Federalism is built into how America works. It influences everything. The policies that shape our communities, even our personal choices. It's not just some abstract legal stuff. It's about the real lives of people all across the country.
So we've kind of laid the groundwork here. We've explored these important clauses that really shape how power flows in the U.S. But now let's bring it home. How does all of this actually work in real life? You mentioned earlier federalism being like a tug of war. It's not always smooth sailing, is it?
No, you're right. History's full of these clashes
Yeah.
between the federal government and the states, each one fighting for power. Just look at the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
Such a brutal conflict. And it all came down to this very tension we're talking about. States' rights versus federal authority, with the issue of slavery right at the center of it all.
It's a powerful reminder that this isn't just some theoretical stuff. This has real consequences, shaping the course of history. And even now, this tension is still alive, right?
Yeah.
Look at the debates about immigration, gun control, environmental rules. It's this constant push and pull.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to really understand the nuances of federalism. It's a system that's always in motion, changing as society changes, responding to political pressures, even adapting to new technologies.
So what are some of the hot-button issues right now, where this whole federal-state dynamic is really playing out?
Healthcare is a perfect example. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as some people call it, it really shows how federalism works in practice. The federal government set up the framework for expanding healthcare coverage. But then states got a lot of freedom in how they put the law into action. And this led to a real patchwork of coverage and costs across the country.
It's like every state is adding its own patch to a quilt. Some states were all in on the Affordable Care Act. They expanded Medicaid, while others really pushed back, leading to legal battles and political fights. It's amazing how one law sparks such different reactions.
I know, right? And that's both the beauty and the challenge of federalism. It allows for flexibility, lets states try new things. States become these laboratories of democracy, trying different solutions to policy problems. But it can also lead to inconsistencies, even inequalities, where people in different states end up with vastly different levels of services or benefits.
It's a trade-off then. You gain that local control, but you risk having a lack of unity and differences in how things are done across the country. Finding that sweet spot, that balance, seems like a constant struggle.
It really is. And that's where being an informed citizen is so important. Understanding federalism, knowing what both the federal and state governments are responsible for, and being involved in the political process at both levels, these are all crucial for making sure the system works for the people.
So it's not just about knowing our rights. It's about understanding how power actually works, knowing how to push for the policies we believe in. But that can feel so overwhelming, especially with how massive and complicated the U.S. government is. Where do we even begin?
You know, one good thing about federalism is that it gives more chances for people to participate. State and local governments are usually easier to reach than the federal government. This lets individuals have a bigger impact on policies closer to home.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel insignificant when you think about national politics. But at the state and local levels, our voices can actually be heard. We can make a real difference on things that matter to us.
Exactly. So pay attention to what's going on in your state legislature. Get involved with your local officials. Make your voice heard. When federalism works well, it creates a government that is more responsive and representative, but it needs people to actively participate.
So it's not just about what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's about the decisions being made closer to home, right? In our state capitals, city council meetings, school board gatherings. It's about understanding how those decisions connect to what's going on nationally and how we can influence them.
Exactly. And that brings us back to our main question. How can we make sure this balance of power actually works for everyone? It's a conversation that never ends, a constant back and forth of negotiation and adaptation. And to really participate in this conversation, we need to understand federalism, the key clauses that shape how it works, and what it all means in the real world.
It's like having a roadmap to navigate this whole intricate world of American government. And that roadmap can help us be more informed, be better advocates, and ultimately be more active in shaping the future of our country.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, we've covered a lot today, exploring this dynamic system we call federalism. Before we wrap up, let's take a moment to reflect. What are some of the key takeaways for you from our conversation?
For me, it's realizing that federalism isn't just some fixed system. It's a process. It's alive. It's breathing. It's constantly evolving and changing as new challenges come up, as society shifts, even as technology advances. And to really understand American politics, we need to understand how this evolution happens.
I agree. And it's not just about theory. Federalism has a direct impact on the policies that affect our daily lives. Everything from healthcare and education to environmental regulations, even things like driver's licenses. It's about understanding how those policies are made, who
Yeah.
gets to make them, and how we can have a say in those decisions.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that federalism, like any system, it has its good points and bad points. It presents opportunities and challenges. But it's what we have, and we need to understand it if we want to participate in our democracy effectively.
It's about being able to see the big picture, recognizing how the federal government and the states interact,
Yeah.
and then finding those places where we can make our voices heard. It's about being informed, engaged, and empowered citizens.
You got it. So, as we move forward, think about this. How can we make sure this balance of power keeps working for everyone, both at the national and state levels? It's a question that's been debated since the beginning of our country, and it will continue to shape our political landscape for generations to come.
That's a question worth thinking about, and a conversation worth continuing. We've been on this deep dive looking at how federal and state power work together in the U.S., and it's obvious that this back and forth has shaped so much of our country's past, and it's still affecting us today. But where can we go to keep learning about this dynamic system, even after our conversation here?
Well, there are a ton of resources out there. Like, a really good place to start is your state's website. You'll find so much information there, like the actual text of your state's constitution and details about the laws being debated in your state legislature.
It's like getting a behind-the-scenes look at your state government. You can see how laws are made, track bills, and even find out how to contact your representatives.
Yeah, exactly. And don't forget about local news. They often do a great job covering issues that directly affect your community. They show those real-life examples of how federalism works on the ground.
It's like having a front row seat to how policies are made. You can see how those federal guidelines we talked about get turned into local rules, or how state funding decisions affect your schools or roads.
Right. And if you're interested in a bigger national perspective, there are a lot of organizations that focus on researching and analyzing federalism, like the National Conference of State Legislatures. They have tons of resources on state policy trends and how the relationship between states and the federal government is changing.
It's like having this whole team of experts you can learn from. You can use their research, their analysis, their insights to understand this complex system even better.
Absolutely. And you can always dive into academic journals and books about federalism. Don't be scared off. Many scholars write in a way that's easy to understand and even engaging. They can offer new perspectives and that historical context that can really enrich your understanding.
It's like tracing the history of how people have thought about this concept.
Hmm.
You can see how different thinkers have grappled with the balance between national unity and state power, and how those ideas have shaped American politics over time.
Exactly. And remember, learning about federalism is an ongoing process. It's a journey. The more you explore, the more you'll appreciate how intricate this system is and how much it affects our lives.
It's like putting together a big puzzle. With each piece, we get a clearer picture of how power works in the U.S., and the more pieces we fit together, the more empowered we become as citizens.
I like that analogy. So as we wrap up this deep dive into federalism, I'll leave you with one final thought. How will this balance of power between the federal government and states change in the 21st century? What new challenges are coming? How can we, as informed and active citizens, make sure this system really works for everyone?
Those are some important questions to think about,
Yeah.
and they show why it's so crucial to stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Federalism isn't set in stone. It's this dynamic process that needs our attention and participation. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep trying to understand this fascinating system that shapes our nation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into federalism. We hope you learned something new, and maybe even gained a new appreciation for this fundamental part of American government around it.